The fastest way to lose a badge isn't breaking the law. It's forgetting who the law was meant to protect. The dinner crowd inside Ashford House had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a Thursday evening. Crystal glasses caught the warm glow of vintage chandeliers. Soft jazz drifted through the dining room, while waiters moved gracefully between polished oak tables carrying plates that looked more like artwork than food. It was the kind of restaurant where anniversaries were celebrated, business deals were quietly finalized, and strangers politely nodded to one another without asking names. Near the back of the room, away from the windows and the attention, sat a man in a charcoal sport coat, reading through a leather folder beside an untouched cup of coffee. Donovan Pierce preferred quiet places. After another demanding day in Washington, D.C., silence felt more valuable than luxury. No security detail hovered nearby. No television cameras followed him. There was nothing about his appearance that suggested he was one of the most respected legal minds in America. To everyone around him, he looked like another customer finishing a late dinner before heading home. The hostess smiled politely each time she walked past his table. A young waiter had just refilled his coffee without being asked. For nearly 40 minutes, the evening had been peaceful. Then the front doors swung open. Officer Ryan McCallister entered wearing his department uniform, his radio crackling softly against his shoulder as conversations around the room briefly faded. He had responded to what dispatch described as a complaint involving an argumentative customer refusing to cooperate with restaurant management. Ryan scanned the dining room with practiced confidence, his eyes moving from table to table until they landed on Donovan. He paused only for a second before making up his mind. Without speaking to the manager first, without asking what had happened, and without listening to anyone else in the room, he began walking directly toward the quiet table in the corner. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. The restaurant manager hurried after him, trying to explain that the situation had already been misunderstood, but Ryan barely slowed his pace. His expression hardened with every step. Donovan calmly looked up from the folder as the officer stopped beside the table. "Evening," Donovan said politely, closing the folder without the slightest sign of irritation. Ryan ignored the greeting. "Stand up," he ordered flatly. Nearby conversations stopped completely. Forks rested silently against porcelain plates. The jazz continued playing, but somehow the room felt much quieter than before. Donovan remained seated for only a moment, studying the officer with composed eyes that revealed neither fear nor anger. "May I ask why?" he said in an even voice. Ryan folded his arms. "Because you've overstayed your welcome, and this restaurant doesn't need problems tonight." A couple sitting near the fireplace looked at one another in confusion. They had watched Donovan quietly reading for nearly an hour. He had never raised his voice. He had barely looked away from his coffee. The manager finally caught up, slightly out of breath. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he began carefully. Ryan raised one hand, cutting him off before another word could leave his mouth. "I'm handling this." Every phone remained tucked away for now, but curious eyes followed every second unfolding at the corner table. Donovan slowly rose to his feet, straightened his jacket, and looked directly at the officer. His voice stayed remarkably calm. "Officer," he said, "are you absolutely certain this is the decision you want to make tonight?" For the first time since walking through the restaurant doors, an almost invisible hesitation crossed Ryan McCallister's face, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced once again by the confidence of a man who believed his badge answered every question before anyone else had the chance. The manager swallowed hard, sensing that the atmosphere inside the restaurant had shifted from ordinary discomfort to something far more dangerous. Michael Reynolds had spent almost 20 years managing Ashford House. An experience had taught him that appearances often deceived. Wealth could be hidden beneath denim, authority behind quiet, manners, and character inside the smallest gestures. That was why he had noticed Donovan Pierce the moment he walked through the front door earlier that evening. The gentleman had arrived alone just before 7 o'clock, holding the door open for an elderly couple before greeting the hostess with a warm smile. He had waited patiently while another party was seated first, insisting that there was no rush because everyone deserved a pleasant evening. Throughout dinner, he had thanked every server by name after reading their name tags, complimented the chef for preparing a simple meal with care, and even left a handwritten note praising a young waiter who had admitted it was his first week on the job. Nothing about Donovan had drawn attention. In fact, he seemed determined not to attract any. Michael remembered wondering why someone with such remarkable composure seemed strangely familiar, but the answer never came to him. Now, standing only a few feet away, he watched Officer Ryan McCallister treat that same guest as though courtesy no longer mattered. The silence spreading through the dining room felt heavier than any raised voice could have. A woman celebrating her anniversary quietly reached across the table and squeezed her husband's hand. A businessman lowered his phone after pretending to answer an email, his attention fixed entirely on the unfolding exchange. Even the musicians in the corner exchanged uncertain looks as their soft melody continued almost automatically. Donovan remained perfectly still. His breathing never changed. His shoulders stayed relaxed. He looked neither offended nor intimidated. Years spent inside courtrooms had taught him that the loudest person was rarely the strongest one. Truth did not become more powerful because someone shouted it. It simply waited for the right moment to be heard. Ryan interpreted that calmness differently. To him, it looked like defiance. He took a slow step closer and spoke with the firm confidence of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "You were asked to leave. I'm asking again." Michael finally found the courage to interrupt. "Officer, nobody actually asked him to leave. There was confusion about another reservation, but we resolved that several minutes ago." Ryan barely glanced at him. "Then why was dispatch called?" Michael hesitated. Before he could answer, one of the younger employees quietly admitted, "A customer insisted we report a suspicious man because he thought this gentleman did not belong in the private dining section." Several guests looked down at their tables, uncomfortable with the words hanging in the air. Donovan simply nodded as though the explanation confirmed something he had seen many times before. He slowly reached for his wallet, not with urgency or fear, but with the deliberate patience of someone refusing to let another person's assumptions dictate his own dignity. Ryan watched every movement carefully while several diners instinctively leaned forward in their seats. Yet instead of removing identification, Donovan pulled out a small folded receipt. "Before anything else," he said gently, placing it on the table, "I would like to settle my bill. I have no intention of leaving without paying for my meal." The unexpected response caught nearly everyone by surprise. There was no argument, no accusation, no attempt to embarrass anyone, only quiet respect for the people who had served him. Michael felt a knot tighten in his stomach because decent people did not usually behave this way under pressure. They certainly did not think first about making sure a waiter received proper payment. For the first time that evening, several people in the dining room began wondering whether the wrong person had been questioned from the very beginning. Ryan McCallister stared at the receipt resting neatly on the polished table as though he had expected something entirely different. The calmness in front of him did not fit the story he had already written in his own mind. Most people argued when confronted. Some became defensive. Others tried to leave. Donovan Pierce had done none of those things. Instead, he had thanked the waiter for refilling his coffee one last time and placed enough cash beside the receipt to leave a generous tip. The young waiter blinked in disbelief, almost embarrassed to accept it. "Sir, you really do not have to do that," he whispered. Donovan offered him a reassuring smile. "Kindness should never become collateral damage because of someone else's decisions," he replied softly. The words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Around the dining room, expressions began to change. People who had quietly accepted the officer's confidence only moments earlier now found themselves questioning everything they had assumed. A retired school principal seated near the entrance leaned toward her daughter and murmured, "That is not the voice of a man looking for trouble." Nearby, a middle-aged attorney visiting from Arlington had watched the exchange from the beginning. There was something strangely familiar about the guest's posture, the careful choice of words, and the unmistakable discipline with which he carried himself. The attorney narrowed his eyes, searching his memory, convinced he had seen that face somewhere beyond newspapers or television interviews. Before the thought could fully form, Ryan spoke again. "I asked you to leave, not settle into another conversation." His tone remained controlled, but a trace of impatience had begun creeping into every sentence. Donovan nodded respectfully. "And I have every intention of leaving peacefully once my obligations here are complete." Ryan folded his arms. "You seem to think you make the rules." Donovan answered with quiet sincerity. "No, officer. I simply believe everyone should follow the same ones." The simplicity of the statement unsettled more people than any argument could have. Michael Reynolds noticed several diners discreetly placing their phones on the table, not to create a spectacle, but because something about the interaction felt important enough to remember accurately. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody interrupted. It was as though the entire restaurant instinctively understood they were witnessing more than a disagreement between a customer and a police officer. They were watching two very different ideas of authority standing face to face. Across the room, the hostess suddenly froze while checking another reservation. Her eyes moved from the computer screen to Donovan and back again. She quietly clicked through the reservation notes one more time before walking quickly toward Michael. Keeping her voice barely above a whisper, she said, "The reservation was not under his personal name. It was arranged through a federal office." Michael felt his heartbeat quicken. "Are you certain?" She nodded. "There is a special request for privacy and absolutely no publicity." Michael looked back toward Donovan with growing concern. Pieces that had never seemed connected began fitting together with alarming speed. Meanwhile, the attorney from Arlington slowly stood from his chair, never taking his eyes off Donovan. He stepped cautiously closer, studying the distinguished face that had seemed familiar from the moment he arrived. Then his expression changed completely. His eyes widened, and the color drained from his face. He stopped several feet away, almost afraid to interrupt. In a voice barely louder than a breath, he quietly said, "Your Honor." The single phrase floated through the silent dining room like the first distant sound of thunder before a storm. Donovan turned calmly toward the man and offered the same gentle smile he had shown everyone else that evening. He did not confirm anything. He did not deny anything. But the respectful nod he gave was enough to make the attorney instinctively straighten his posture. At that exact moment, Michael Reynolds realized the evening was about to change in a way that none of them could possibly undo. The attorney instinctively placed one hand over his chest, the kind of unconscious gesture reserved for moments when respect outweighed surprise. "Good evening, Your Honor," he repeated, this time loud enough for several nearby tables to hear. The words spread across the dining room faster than any whisper could have. Conversations stopped completely. A server carrying 2 plates froze beside the wine display. The pianist quietly lifted his hands from the keys, allowing the final note to fade naturally into the silence. Michael Reynolds felt every uneasy thought from the past several minutes rush together at once. The reservation from a federal office, the request for privacy, the extraordinary courtesy, the familiar face. It all suddenly made perfect sense. Ryan McCallister, however, did not share that realization. His expression hardened as he looked from the attorney back to Donovan. "Your Honor," he repeated with unmistakable skepticism. "That is supposed to change something?" The attorney looked stunned. "Officer, I think you should slow down for just a moment." Ryan shook his head. "No. I think everyone here is making this more complicated than it has to be." Donovan remained composed, his hands resting comfortably at his sides. He neither encouraged the attorney nor corrected the officer. Instead, he quietly observed the room, almost as though he were measuring not the words being spoken, but the character behind them. The attorney carefully reached into his jacket pocket and removed a business card. "My name is Charles Bennett," he said. "I have argued before the Supreme Court twice. I recognize Justice Donovan Pierce." Several heads immediately turned toward Donovan. A woman near the entrance covered her mouth in disbelief. Another guest quietly searched the name on his phone, his eyes widening almost instantly as official photographs appeared on the screen. He looked up at the man, standing only a few yards away, comparing the image to the calm face before him. They matched perfectly. Michael noticed the change ripple through the restaurant one table at a time. Guests who had arrived expecting nothing more than a pleasant dinner were now standing at the edge of history, unfolding in complete silence. Ryan glanced briefly at the glowing phone screen someone had unintentionally left visible, then dismissed it with a shrug. "Anyone can find a picture online," he replied. "That proves nothing." Donovan finally spoke again, his voice carrying the same measured calm that had defined the evening from the beginning. "You are correct, officer. A photograph alone proves very little." He slowly reached inside his sport coat. Every movement was deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Instead of rushing, he carefully removed a slim black leather credential holder and held it closed in his hand without presenting it. His eyes met Ryan's steadily. "Before I show you anything," Donovan said, "I would like to ask you one question." Ryan crossed his arms once more. "Go ahead." Donovan's expression remained thoughtful rather than confrontational. "If I were not who these people believe I am, would I deserve less respect than anyone else in this room?" The question settled over the restaurant with remarkable weight. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. Even those who had never studied constitutional law understood that the issue had quietly shifted. It was no longer about identity. It was about dignity. Ryan searched for an immediate response, but found none. For the first time that evening, certainty gave way to hesitation. Michael watched the officer's confidence begin to crack beneath a question that required neither rank nor authority to understand. Donovan gently opened the credential holder just enough for Ryan to see the official seal inside before closing it again without allowing anyone else a closer look. He made no dramatic announcement. He demanded no apology. He simply waited, giving the officer one final opportunity to let judgment give way to wisdom before the truth became impossible for anyone in the room. To ignore Ryan McCallister held his gaze for several long seconds, saying nothing as the weight of the moment settled over the dining room. The official seal he had glimpsed inside the credential holder was unmistakable, yet pride urged him to question what common sense had already begun to accept. Around him, the room remained perfectly still. Nobody reached for another bite of food. Nobody resumed a conversation. It felt as though time itself had slowed, waiting to see what choice would come next. Donovan Pierce quietly slipped the credential holder back inside his jacket without displaying it to anyone else. He had never intended to impress the room. Recognition was not the point. Character was. Michael Reynolds drew a slow breath and finally stepped forward. "Justice Pierce," he said with sincere regret. "On behalf of everyone at Ashford House, I am deeply sorry that your evening has unfolded this way." Donovan met the manager's eyes with calm understanding. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I know courtesy still lives in this building." Those simple words eased some of the tension from the manager's face, but they carried another message as well. Donovan was separating individual actions from institutional responsibility. He refused to condemn an entire restaurant for the decisions of one person. Charles Bennett quietly approached Donovan and lowered his voice. "Your Honor, would you like me to contact the marshal's office?" Donovan gently shook his head. "No, there is no emergency here. Let us allow everyone the opportunity to make thoughtful decisions before unnecessary attention arrives." The attorney nodded immediately. His respect only deepened. Ryan listened carefully to every exchange. The confidence that had carried him through the evening was beginning to feel increasingly isolated. Dispatch had mentioned only a disturbance. The manager had never confirmed any wrongdoing. The customer had remained respectful from beginning to end. Every witness in the room had observed the same facts. Yet Ryan realized that nearly every decision he had made had been based on assumptions formed before asking even the simplest questions. A soft vibration interrupted the silence. Ryan looked down at the mobile data terminal attached inside his patrol vehicle through the restaurant window. Another message from dispatch had appeared. The original caller had updated the report after restaurant staff clarified that there had been no refusal to pay, no threats, and no disorderly conduct. The disturbance had been classified as resolved before Ryan had even entered the building. Michael noticed Ryan reading the update. His shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly. The realization settled heavily across the officer's expression. He had walked into a situation that no longer required police intervention and had transformed a peaceful evening into something entirely different. Donovan observed the change without satisfaction. He had spent decades studying human behavior from the highest bench in the nation. He knew that the hardest verdict anyone could face was the one delivered by an honest conscience. Quietly, he picked up his folded receipt and slid it into his wallet. Then he turned toward the young waiter. "Please make certain everyone working tonight knows the meal was excellent," he said warmly. "Your hospitality deserves to be remembered for that, not for what happened afterward." The young man managed a grateful smile despite everything that had unfolded. Several diners exchanged thoughtful glances. The story they would carry home was no longer about a famous public servant. It was about witnessing extraordinary restraint when resentment would have been easier. Outside, the lights of passing traffic reflected across the restaurant windows as another unmarked government sedan slowly entered the parking lot. Nobody inside had called for it. Nobody had requested assistance. Yet its quiet arrival suggested that somewhere beyond the walls of Ashford House, people had already begun learning exactly where Justice Donovan Pierce had spent his evening. The black sedan came to a quiet stop beneath the glow of the restaurant's entrance lights. Its arrival attracted almost no attention from passing traffic, but inside Ashford House, every pair of eyes instinctively shifted toward the windows. The vehicle carried no flashing lights and displayed no obvious markings, yet there was something unmistakably official about the way it parked with calm precision. Two professionally dressed men stepped out, neither rushing nor creating unnecessary attention. They entered the restaurant with measured confidence, scanning the room only once before walking directly toward Donovan Pierce. Neither man addressed the crowd. Neither acknowledged the growing curiosity surrounding them. Instead, both stopped a respectful distance from Donovan and offered a polite nod. "Good evening, Justice Pierce," the older of the two said warmly. "We apologize for the interruption to your evening." Donovan returned the greeting with the same calm expression he had maintained from the beginning. "Good evening, David. There is no need for an apology. Everyone here has simply been presented with an opportunity to learn something." The words landed gently, but their meaning echoed through the silent room. Ryan McCallister watched the exchange with growing disbelief. There was no longer room for doubt. The men standing before Donovan carried official government credentials openly clipped inside their jackets. One of them quietly presented identification to Michael Reynolds, who read it only long enough to confirm what he already suspected before immediately handing it back with visible respect. Charles Bennett lowered his eyes, almost relieved that the truth had finally become undeniable. Several diners slowly stood from their tables, not out of excitement, but from instinctive respect for the office Donovan represented. Still, Donovan motioned softly for everyone to remain comfortable. "Please," he said with an easy smile. "You came here to enjoy dinner, not to witness a spectacle." His humility somehow made the room even quieter. Ryan looked toward the restaurant manager before speaking. "Why did nobody tell me who he was?" Michael answered honestly. "Because it should not have mattered." The simple reply struck with more force than any accusation. Ryan searched for another explanation, but found only silence. The older government official finally turned toward him. His tone remained professional and completely free of hostility. "Officer, Justice Pierce requested that we allow this matter to unfold without intervention. Otherwise, we would have arrived much sooner." Ryan blinked in surprise. "He asked you not to step in?" "Yes," the official replied. He believed everyone deserved the chance to act according to their own judgment before outside authority influenced the situation. Those words settled heavily across the dining room. Donovan had possessed every opportunity to reveal his position within seconds. Instead, he had deliberately allowed the interaction to continue, not to embarrass anyone, but to reveal something far more important than identity. Character had exposed itself without being forced. Donovan looked directly at Ryan, his expression unchanged. "Officer McCallister," he said quietly, "the Constitution does not recognize greater dignity for one citizen than another. Neither should we." Ryan lowered his eyes for the first time that evening. The certainty that had once defined every decision now gave way to reflection. He replayed each moment in his mind, realizing that every conclusion had been formed before every fact had been gathered. The government official spoke again, this time addressing both Donovan and the manager. "Justice Pierce, transportation is ready whenever you wish." Donovan nodded, but did not move immediately. Instead, he turned back toward the young waiter who had served him throughout the evening. "Thank you for treating every guest with kindness," he said. "Never allow another person's assumptions to change the way you serve people." The young man smiled with quiet gratitude. Around the restaurant, several guests understood they had witnessed something far more lasting than a famous man revealing his title. They had watched genuine authority expressed through patience, restraint, and unwavering respect for others. Outside, the evening air remained calm. But inside Ashford House, every person present knew that before the night was over, this quiet lesson in dignity would reach far beyond the walls of a single restaurant. Justice Donovan Pierce accepted his coat from one of the government officials. But instead of walking toward the exit, he paused beside the table where he had quietly eaten dinner less than an hour earlier. His untouched coffee had grown cold. The leather folder remained exactly where he had left it. Looking around the room, he saw faces that had changed. Some reflected embarrassment. Others showed admiration. Most simply revealed people reconsidering assumptions they had never realized they carried. "Ladies and gentlemen," Donovan said gently, his voice carrying naturally through the silent dining room. "Thank you for your patience this evening. I hope the rest of your dinner will be remembered for better reasons than this interruption." A few guests nodded respectfully. Others quietly applauded, not because they had witnessed a dramatic confrontation, but because they had witnessed extraordinary restraint. Donovan acknowledged the gesture with a modest smile before turning toward Ryan McCallister one final time. "Officer," he said, "I would like to ask one favor." Ryan looked up immediately. "Yes, sir." It was the first time he had spoken without the confidence that had marked every earlier sentence. Donovan continued calmly. "Do not remember me because of my position. Remember tonight because the next person you meet may never have a title anyone recognizes. Their dignity deserves the very same protection." Ryan felt the words settle deeper than any formal reprimand ever could. He understood that Donovan was offering something few people received after making a serious mistake: the opportunity to learn before someone else imposed the lesson. The older government official quietly checked his watch before stepping aside to answer a brief call. When he returned, he leaned toward Donovan and spoke softly enough that only those closest could hear. "The Chief Justice has already been informed that your evening was unexpectedly eventful." He asked only one question. Donovan smiled faintly. "And what was that?" He asked whether everyone was safe. Donovan nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Then the answer is yes." Michael Reynolds heard the exchange and found himself unexpectedly moved. After everything that had happened, the highest concern from one of the nation's most powerful judicial leaders had not been reputation or publicity. It had been the well-being of strangers sharing a restaurant. At that moment, Michael understood why Donovan Pierce had earned the respect that surrounded his name. Outside, another patrol vehicle slowly entered the parking lot. This time it was Captain Laura Whitaker, Ryan's supervising officer. She had reviewed the updated dispatch notes while driving and immediately recognized that the original report no longer matched the circumstances unfolding inside. Entering the restaurant with calm professionalism, she greeted Donovan respectfully before turning her attention to Ryan. "Officer McCallister," she said evenly, "I will need you to remain available after your shift. Internal documentation will be required." Ryan answered quietly, "Yes, Captain." There was no argument, no attempt to defend what had already become impossible to justify. Captain Whitaker thanked the restaurant staff for preserving security camera footage and politely requested copies of the body camera recording in accordance with Department procedure. Every instruction was delivered without anger, reminding everyone present that accountability did not require humiliation. It required facts. Donovan appreciated the professionalism. Before leaving, he walked once more toward the young waiter who had served him with such genuine kindness. Reaching into his wallet, he placed another folded note beside the generous tip already waiting on the table. "This is not because of tonight," he said warmly. "It is because excellence deserves encouragement." The young waiter looked down after Donovan stepped away. Inside the folded note was a simple handwritten sentence that would stay with him for years. "The way you treat people when nobody is watching is the truest measure of who you are." As Donovan finally walked toward the entrance beneath the quiet glow of the restaurant lights, nearly everyone in the room instinctively stood, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect had quietly earned its place where authority alone never could. By the time Justice Donovan Pierce's sedan disappeared into the Washington night, the dining room had slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, but nobody inside Ashford House felt quite the same. Conversations resumed in softer voices. Meals continued, yet nearly every table found itself discussing the same lesson without ever needing to mention titles or positions. Michael Reynolds remained near the entrance, thanking guests as they departed while quietly assuring them that the restaurant would cooperate fully with every official request. Inside his office, he carefully saved copies of the security footage onto encrypted storage before forwarding them according to department procedure. Nothing would be edited. Nothing would be omitted. Facts, he believed, deserved to remain exactly as they had occurred. Outside, Captain Laura Whitaker stood beside Ryan McCallister's patrol vehicle beneath the pale glow of the parking lot lights. The evening air had grown cooler, carrying only the distant sound of passing traffic. Ryan removed his patrol notebook and handed it to his captain without being asked. She accepted it calmly before speaking. "Walk me through every decision you made tonight." Ryan did not search for excuses. He described the dispatch call, his arrival, the assumptions he formed, and the choices that followed. Captain Whitaker listened without interruption. When he finished, she remained silent for several seconds before quietly asking, "At what point did you verify that a crime had actually occurred?" Ryan lowered his eyes. He knew the answer. "I did not." She nodded once. "That omission matters." Her voice never became harsh because professionalism did not require raised volume. Authority begins with observation, not conclusion. Ryan leaned against the patrol vehicle, replaying every moment from the restaurant in his mind. He remembered ignoring the manager's explanation. He remembered dismissing the attorney's recognition. Most of all, he remembered Donovan's question. "If I were not who these people believe I am, would I deserve less respect than anyone else in this room?" No training manual had ever asked him something so direct. Yet no departmental policy could have expressed its purpose more clearly. Meanwhile, several miles away, Donovan arrived home carrying nothing more than the leather folder and the same quiet composure he had displayed throughout the evening. His wife greeted him with a warm smile before noticing the unusual expression on his face. "Long day?" she asked gently. Donovan hung his coat before answering. "Educational," he replied with a thoughtful smile. For more than one person. He did not mention headlines. He did not mention recognition. Instead, he sat beside the window with a fresh cup of tea, opened the folder he had barely touched during dinner, and continued reviewing tomorrow's case as though the evening had been nothing more than another reminder of why justice required patience as much as wisdom. Back at the precinct, Captain Whitaker completed the initial incident report before forwarding it through the proper chain of command. Along with the dispatch records, she attached the restaurant security footage, body camera recordings, witness statements, and the updated call log showing that the original complaint had been resolved before Ryan entered the building. Every document would be reviewed according to department policy. Every decision would be based on evidence rather than assumption. Shortly before dawn, Ryan quietly entered the nearly empty locker room. The building felt unusually still. He removed his equipment one piece at a time, placing each item carefully into his locker. Then he looked down at the metal badge fastened to his uniform. For years, he had believed it represented authority. Tonight, he understood that it represented responsibility first. A few minutes later, after meeting with command staff, he was instructed to surrender the badge pending the outcome of the administrative review. No dramatic speeches followed. No public humiliation unfolded. Only the quiet sound of metal resting on a supervisor's desk marked the beginning of accountability. As the first light of morning crept across the horizon, Ryan walked outside without the symbol he had once believed gave him unquestioned power, while somewhere across the city, Justice Donovan Pierce had already begun another day devoted to protecting the equal dignity of every citizen, including those who had failed to recognize it the night before. Several weeks later, the story had quietly faded from the headlines, replaced by newer events competing for the nation's attention. Yet for the people whose lives had intersected inside Ashford House that evening, nothing about it had truly ended. The restaurant had become known for something far more meaningful than its elegant menu. New employees learned the story during orientation, not as gossip, but as a reminder that every guest deserved to be welcomed with equal dignity. Michael Reynolds framed the handwritten note Donovan Pierce had left for the young waiter and placed it in the staff hallway, where every employee passed before beginning a shift. The simple sentence became part of the restaurant's culture. The way you treat people when nobody is watching is the truest measure of who you are. Guests occasionally asked about the framed message. Michael would simply smile and say that it represented the kind of hospitality no policy manual could ever fully teach. The young waiter who had received Donovan's encouragement eventually enrolled in law school. Whenever friends asked what inspired such a dramatic change, he always thought back to one quiet evening when the most respected man in the room never once reminded anyone of his position. Across the city, Officer Ryan McCallister continued participating in additional professional training required during the administrative process. Every class focused on judgment, communication, procedural fairness, and the responsibility carried by public trust. The lessons were difficult because they forced honest reflection rather than easy answers. For the first time in his career, Ryan understood that authority was never measured by how quickly someone could give orders. It was measured by how carefully someone listened before reaching conclusions. He carried a small notebook with him wherever he went. On the first page, he had written the question Donovan had asked inside the restaurant. If I were not who these people believe I am, would I deserve less respect than anyone else in this room? He read it often, allowing the words to challenge every assumption before it became a decision. Donovan Pierce never contacted the department to demand punishment. He never appeared on television discussing the incident. He never sought recognition for the patience he had shown. Instead, he continued serving on the nation's highest court exactly as he always had, believing that justice lost part of its strength whenever it became a performance instead of principle. Months later, while speaking to a group of law students about constitutional responsibility, Donovan shared a thought without mentioning names or places. The greatest test of character, he told them, comes when nobody knows who you are. If respect depends on recognition, then it was never respect to begin with. The students wrote down every word. Some believed they were hearing a legal lecture. Others realized they were hearing a lesson about life itself. On a quiet evening not long afterward, Michael Reynolds looked around the dining room of Ashford House as families laughed together, friends celebrated birthdays, and strangers enjoyed peaceful conversations over dinner. Everything appeared ordinary, yet he knew ordinary moments often carried extraordinary opportunities. Every person who entered through those front doors brought a story invisible to everyone else. Some carried titles, others carried burdens. All deserved the same welcome. Somewhere across Washington, Donovan Pierce finished another day of reviewing cases that would shape the future of countless Americans he would never meet. Before leaving his chambers, he paused for a moment beside the marble inscription carved inside the courthouse, reading the familiar words that had guided generations before him. Equal justice under law. He smiled quietly, not because the nation had already perfected those ideals, but because every day offered another chance to move closer to them. And perhaps that was the lesson hidden inside one ordinary dinner that became unforgettable. A uniform can command attention. A title can command respect. But only character can earn trust. Ryan once believed power rested in the badge pinned to his chest. Donovan understood that true authority had always lived somewhere far more permanent. By the time the sun rose after that unforgettable night, one man had surrendered a piece of metal, while another had reminded everyone watching that the strongest symbol of justice has never been a badge, a robe, or a courtroom. It has always been the simple decision to see another human being as fully worthy before knowing anything else about them. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.